Alaska, early 1953. Inside the exclusive and strictly segregated Fairbanks Country Club, the territory's wealthy elite danced the night away. But across the crowded room, a dangerous spark ignites. Diane Wells, dubbed the most beautiful woman in Alaska and wife of millionaire tycoon Cecil Wells, locks eyes with the band's drummer, Johnny Warren. There are just two problems. They are both married, and in the unforgiving grip of 1950s Jim Crow America, she is white and he is black. It is a forbidden romance that will trigger the brutal execution of one of Alaska's most powerful men. What follows is a frantic investigation, a national media circus, the threat of a sensational death penalty trial, and a desperate flight to Hollywood that ends in a tragic suicide. The 1950s is a time rightfully lauded as an era of family values. It was also a time of social change, both within American society and in pop culture, both of which resonate today. However, human nature is a constant for any time period, and the 1950s, being occupied by human beings, was concerned with the same social ills that have plagued humanity since the beginning of our existence. These were issues of poverty, social unrest, political instability and agendas, and crime. To deny that violent crime was a concern of 1950s society, to downplay or even state that such incidents did not exist or were supposedly unimportant, is to deny ourselves our ability to learn about our shared humanity and to hopefully reduce or even prevent such acts from occurring again. For both the highest aspirations of human kindness and the worst examples of the dark side of human nature have always existed side by side throughout humankind's existence. It is true today, and it was also true during the good old days of the post-World War II era of the late 1940s through the early 1960s, and during the actual decade between those two that was the golden age of America. To leave out the bad parts of history is to actually dismiss the concerns that society of the past held, or to learn from the lessons that they left us. It is with this spirit that we present this series, True Crimes of the Atomic Age, the 1950s. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Fairbanks was a city attempting to outrun its own shadow. It was a frontier town desperate for the legitimacy of statehood, yet still bound by the lawless instincts of the gold rush. At the apex of this frozen society sat Cecil Wells and his young wife Diane. To the outside world, she was the Alaskan blonde, a striking 31-year-old socialite who seemed to possess everything the post-war American dream could offer. But the headlines that would later define her rarely captured the truth of the woman trapped inside room 815.
Still such a modern story, because we see in true crime today, when there's an attractive blonde, actually it doesn't have to be blonde, but that's the one that media seems to prefer. When there's an attractive woman and her husband or a boyfriend seems to have been killed, people always seem to think it's the woman that's done it.
Especially if he's older and rich, right?
Yeah, especially if they're an older, rich businessman, or they're less attractive, or they seem to be someone who you think, how did he end up with her? We
rich.
Always seem to immediately, we always seem to go for the, oh, well, we see what she was with him for. We can see what that was for, and she found her first advantage, and she lured some sucker in and had him kill him, or she killed him, and they were going to run away together. But again, doing the research, I found that, Cecil and Diane's relationship seemed to be a genuine love match. They met, he was enamored of her, they got married, he and she sort of conspired to kind of fudge the marriage certificate so that they could get married earlier because she wasn't quite fully divorced. So he was obviously keen to marry, but again in the 50s, most people got married before they lived together. There really wasn't any living together. So if you wanted to be together, in every sense of the word, you really had to be married. So they got married, and they went on lots of trips together, and I managed to get access to lots of family photos, which one of Cecil's grandsons sent me. Lots of family photos, and again, talking to family members, they had mainly good words to say about her. So then you get a much rounder picture than what you're going to get in, say, the pulp magazines, which just do the picture of her, the picture I've got on my badge, of the startled woman looking like a film noir temptress. She's young, she's blonde, she's attractive. He's rich, he's older, he's dead now. She gets all the money. She has a young, handsome musician husband. There's an air of the forbidden about it. There's sex in it. Again, in the 50s, there's sex in there. And that's the immediate thing to appeal. And that's what we see today in the media today. I mean, if you think about it, it was a rich white businessman today and his younger wife, and she went out with a young black musician. We would still have the same sort of media approach and the same media bias to it. We would still have that sort of inbuilt bias and the tones and the kind of suggestions and implications. It would be the same, which was depressing to read because I thought, wow, this is 70 years ago and this would happen. The same thing would happen to her. They paint her exactly the same way.
Seeking an escape from the suffocating expectations of the Fairbanks elite, Diane found refuge in the dim, rhythmic pulse of the nightclub. It was here that she crossed paths with Johnny Warren. He was 33, charismatic, and a profoundly talented black musician.
It was true that she and Johnny Warren had had an affair. That was true.
She denied it too, correct?
She denied it all the way through to the end. Again, this being the 1950s, Johnny Warren being a black man, that was, in a sense, illegal in many places. Now, not so much in Alaska, because again, it wasn't part of the US, but this is Jim Crow time. Yeah. That, for most people, was more shocking than even the murder, even the thought that she'd killed her husband.
By October of 1953, the tension in Cecil Wells' luxury apartment was tightening like a snare. Johnny Warren quietly packed his bags, preparing to vanish into the lower 48, but the violence arrived before the dawn. In the early hours of October 17th, the silence of the Northward building was broken. Police arrived to find Cecil Wells executed in his sleep. Diane Wells, beaten nearly beyond recognition, offered a terrifying tale of masked intruders and a brutal home invasion.
When Cecil was murdered, it was Diane who called the police. She said that two men had broken into their apartment and pretty much shot Cecil immediately in bed, beat her up, and then took money and jewelry and escaped. Now, initially the police very much believed her because there had been a number of high-profile robberies of well-to-do people in Fairbanks that were very much like that. That's where two men had broken into someone's house or been waiting for them, had a gun, and took jewelry and money, and that had happened several times. There had been a couple of other people who had been killed by these all unsolved home invasions. So initially the police pretty much believed her, and if you look at the pictures of her, and again these are pictures in the paper, and they were printed in Life and a couple of the other magazines that covered it, she has, two black eyes and, cuts on her lips and cuts on her face, and her face is swollen. She's clearly been beaten. That followed the story that she'd been given. She was beaten by one of the two thieves. But 70 years later, or maybe at the time, who knows what people thought, you look at those and the idea that some people would say, well, she was obviously behind the murder, so, what she did was have someone beat her up to make it look like a robbery. Or what she did was she beat herself up, to make it look like a robbery as cover. Or she got a friend to beat her up to make it look as robbery, like as a cover for her cover story. And I always just thought that sounds ridiculous for someone who was an attractive woman and who was quite aware of her appearance. It does seem unusual that you would get someone to beat you up, especially on the face, because I always just thought, well, why not just, if it's a complete setup, why not just have them tie her up, put a gag in her mouth, a blindfold over her eyes, lock her in the cupboard? Then when the police came, she could genuinely say, I didn't see anything. Yeah. And I think people would have believed her more than saying, a friend beat her up.
As detectives sifted through the wreckage, the illusion of a random robbery evaporated. They uncovered the affair. They discovered Warren sent in flight from the territory. In a matter of days, the victim's grieving widow became the prime suspect in a calculated, cold-blooded assassination.
I thought, what could be another reason for her looking like that? And as I found during my research, probably I think because some of these people now who are much older and were a bit more comfortable talking about it, was that Cecil was a violent man, especially when he drank. He was known as a jealous man and a violent man, but I couldn't just take someone's word for that. But there were 2 or 3 people who told me, who were adults at the time, not children, who were adults at the time, that had seen him behave in a very jealous manner and be violent with Diane, in front of witnesses. And it occurred to me, also because I did speak to a former LAPD officer and showed him that photo without giving him any context, and he immediately was like, "Oh, well, this is domestic abuse."
For Police Chief E.V. Danforth, solving the murder of Cecil Wells was not merely a matter of justice. It was a matter of political survival. Alaska was fighting bitterly for statehood, and the federal government was watching. A scandalous unsolved murder of a prominent millionaire was a stain the territory could not afford.
Certainly, E.V. Danforth, Everett Danforth, was the chief of police in Fairbanks at the time of the murder. I mean, he resigned like 6 weeks after the murder. I mean, he was sort of half forced out. I don't think, certainly they would have been, all police investigation at the time, regardless of where it was, would certainly have been a little more aggressive. There wasn't such a thing as Miranda rights, for example, that hadn't come in. Police were certainly not above, certainly with male suspects, using violence and intimidation and, keeping them away from, breaks, not giving them water and food and so forth. That would have been very common at the time. Of course, not acceptable, but so much more common practice at the time than it would be considered to be acceptable now. But I can't imagine that he would have beaten her. I don't think she would have been beaten. I think she might have been thoroughly interrogated. But I think also because she stuck to her story all the way through, I suppose there's only so many times you can say it to her, or rather she can say it to them. If she sticks to the story, there's not much else they can get out of it. I also think probably they were very confident that they were going to find the murder weapon, that they were going to seal this up and get this to court pretty quickly.
The police had their narrative. They had the motive. But in the frantic rush to close the case, they may have looked right past the man who pulled the trigger. Whispers began to circulate about a third suspect, a local dance instructor whose clientele included Fairbanks' wealthy elite.
Yeah, it was such a very interesting character. I mean, like I said, I know I've talked for ages, but I'll try and be brief. Yes, at the time, Diane and Johnny were arrested for the murder within about 2 weeks, more or less 2 weeks of the murder. They were both charged with first-degree murder, and the trial date was set for about 6 months later, in a nutshell. But there was a guy who was working the case, who worked it from the beginning, who was a U.S. Marshal, at the time called Frank Worth. And he was involved with it all the way through, specifically because he went down to Oakland, where Johnny had gone down soon after the murder, to extradite Johnny back to Fairbanks to face the charges. He had liked the guy, and he told reporters, I don't think he had anything to do with it. That's a picture that Frank kept in his private notes, and that's William Colombany. It's a mugshot picture taken in Seattle. And he did about a page and a half on the Cecil Wells murder case. There was a couple of revelations in there that were nowhere in any of the reporting. The first one was that he thought he knew where the murder weapon turned up. But the most important thing she sent me was a picture. That's a picture of Frank, who's the guy on the left without the hat, the US Marshal, and Johnny Warren there with the hat. You can see he's got handcuffs on. Now, as you can see, they're both smiling. They both look quite happy. Now, I thought, why would he keep that photo? And it was because he never really believed Johnny had anything to do with the murder. He felt, very much so, and said publicly and in his notes, that he thought William Colombany had a lot more to do with it. And William Colombany, he was from Guatemala originally. He came up into the States. He'd been in Anchorage as well. He was a dance instructor. He'd had a dance school in Anchorage. He'd been married there. He'd gone up to Fairbanks. He'd opened a dance school there. The dance school he'd opened was in the Northwood building, which is where Cecil and Diane went. They went for lessons. When Diane got out on bail, she went down to Los Angeles, as I mentioned, with her and Cecil's son, Mark. Soon after, William Colombany went down to Los Angeles as well and was sort of her consort and confidant from then on. He was basically with her all the time. He took Mark to school. He was sort of her confidant, and he looked after. And that made me wonder, as I'm sure it did Frank Worth at the time, what did William Colombany have to do with this, if anything? He was an interesting character, and I think today they would have looked a lot more into him. In 1955, 2 years after the murder, William Colombany actually faced charges in relation to the Cecil Wells murder. He was charged with perjury in relation to the murder of Cecil Wells, and he spoke to reporters in Fairbanks, because he was tried in Fairbanks, and he was very confident. He was like, no, there's no way I'm going to prison for this. I'll be out tonight having steak at the Mecca Club. The Mecca's still there, and it's always been it's not a fancy bar by any means, but it's been there for decades. William Colombany was found guilty of perjury, and which does offer 3 to 5 years, but he got 60 days. And he served the 60 days in the local Fairbanks jail, which of course, perjury is a federal crime, but he didn't serve it in there. He served it in the local jail. And the day he was released, William Colombany got out of prison, and he had a party that night. The judge who sentenced him to 60 days was at the party. And then the next day, he left Fairbanks and never went back. The daughter of William Colombany, she said, why would I talk about him? He killed my mother. He left the home. It killed my mother. Broke her heart. That was the third suspect. That was what Frank Worth, the US Marshal, always called William Colombany, was the third suspect.
On November 4th, the trap was sprung. Warrants were issued across state lines. Diane Wells was apprehended at an airport in Seattle, while Johnny Warren was cornered by authorities in Oakland, California. Overnight, the Alaskan mystery became an American obsession.
There's the badge, I made badges of, and there was a very famous photo that all the newspapers used. And that's a picture of her at Seattle Airport, and I put another one on the cover. So that's her when she was arrested at Seattle Airport. And so you see the paparazzi literally in front of her taking her photo. Yes, she was an attractive woman, certainly very much considered so for the time, and I think would be considered conventionally attractive. I know we have very different definitions of what that means now, but she did have a Monroe look about her. She was a blonde. She was younger than Cecil. I mean, she was the younger trophy wife. She was 20 years younger than him. And he dressed her very well. He bought her lots of expensive jewelry and so forth, and mink coats and so forth. And they were a glam couple. He was the older, successful businessman. She was the younger wife. She was his fifth wife. So when they married, she had 5 stepchildren straight away when she turned up in a small town like Fairbanks, because Fairbanks at the time had 5 to 10,000 population, she certainly got a lot of attention from men. And that was part of the reason I wanted to talk to family members and friends of her to see, like, was she someone who encouraged that attention? Was she someone who liked the attention? Was she a vain person? That might all lead into why what might have happened and why she got charged with Cecil's murder.
The media descended, fracturing the story along the deepest fault lines of the 1950s. The mainstream press devoured the pulp fiction narrative of a treacherous blonde and a betrayed millionaire. But publications like Jet magazine focused on the explosive racial reality of a black man caught in the crosshairs of a white justice system, amplifying Warren's claims of an affair that Diane desperately denied.
She denied it all the way through to the end. Again, this being the 1950s, Johnny Warren being a black man, that was, in a sense, illegal. It was more shocking that she'd had an affair with a black man. And Johnny was married to a white woman. They'd been married for quite a few years by that stage. That was more shocking to most people. So she denied it all the way through to the end, vehemently, until pretty much her suicide, when she left behind several suicide notes where she kind of wrote a confession that at least confessed to sort of the affair with Johnny Warren.
The fate of the two alleged lovers took completely different turns during the course of the investigation. Considering the time period, Johnny Warren was, relatively speaking, treated fairly. Even though he was not officially let off the hook until the year 1960, he was granted bail. He did stay in Fairbanks, and the locals, who for the most part believed that he was innocent, or at least he did not pull the trigger, treated him cordially and fairly.
Diane Wells, armed with a $5,000 bond, fled to the cold. She retreated to the fading glamour of Hollywood, claiming she needed medical care for the injuries she sustained the night her husband died. But there was no escaping the ghosts of room 815. On March 9th, 1954, just before she was scheduled to return to Fairbanks, Alaska to face trial, 31-year-old Diane Wells swallowed a lethal overdose of barbiturates. With her final breath, the prosecution's grand case collapsed into dust. Without Diane, the trial against Johnny Warren was quietly dismantled. He walked free. William Colombany remained a phantom, and the murder of Cecil Wells, the Titan who conquered the North, was left officially, permanently unsolved. In the end, the frontier kept its secrets, and the truth of the Alaskan blonde was quietly buried beneath the snow. I want to take this time to thank our patrons, and I want to thank, of course, author James Bartlett for generously donating his time. If you want to support this research work, we have a Patreon page, and the donations are tax deductible, as we are under Atomic Youth, a 501c3 California nonprofit. Check out our other documentaries on this channel, as we have several. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, as we have many more documentaries coming up. And if you're interested in the subject of 1950s true crime, we have these videos up here right now, including this video, which shows what 1950s society thought at the time that they were living and witnessing the events unfold before them. Thank you, spread the word, keep the truth going, and stay safe.